Greetings once again. Mm, We have another book to dive into, another part of the Carib Series. And yes, not better time to introduce one of the most famous accusations about them. We tackle that here. And Boucher does a very good work of covering manuscripts from before his time and encounters before his time. All right. We had to sort out the manuscripts, but we would take it as a holistic here in Cannibal Encounters by Philip Boucher and see the perspective he was coming from in going through these accounts that they labeled cannibal encounters, right? So we go further. Cannibal encounters. European island, Europeans on the island Caribs, 1492 to 1763. Philip P. Boucher. We go right into the meat of it. Chapter 1. This just so what we do is we'd like you to pay attention to the dates as usual. Remember the whole concept of Pan-Africanism does not fit within these records and timeline. So wherever we have dates ranging from the 1400s all the way up to the 1800s, you would see the records was mainly between Europe and the islands and the different wars and encounters. A time frame in which, as you would see here, a lot of wars were taking place, a lot of problems with settling was taking place. So we asked the question to the Pan-Africanists and all the so-called African-minded people who think they come from Africa, practicing religions from Africa, when not 1 ounce of the genetics come from that area, right? So we asked them the question, when between this time, 1400 to the 1800s, when they brought 222 million Africans across here, right? Because there is no record and the timeline doesn't fit for that amount of Africans to be brought here, nor is there any record. So we go into the book, Carib Encounters, Chapter 1, First Impressions, Europeans and Island Caribs in the pre-colonial era, 1492. Now, based on the writer's concept at the time, we have a lot of, how we put, conjecture, not as much as other writers, but we have to look out for that as well. Right? So let's go into it. For more than a century before the English and French colonized Carib-dominated Lesser Antilles, Europeans possessed significant information. Hear this. They possess significant information and misinformation about these quote-unquote cannibals. In Europe, the literary elite became familiar with Hispanic tales of horror about fierce man-eating opponents of European imperialism. To be sure, French and English readers probably responded somewhat differently to the Spanish accounts, in part due to extensive and general friendly French contacts with another cannibal, quote-unquote, people, the Tupinambas of Brazil. And you get a bit of history on them here as well. But for all intents and purposes, even though we all connected, we're trying to more focus on Cairi and the South American plate and the islands within the chain. So the South American plate will include Brazil And so this ties into all what we're doing here because we all related, as you're going to see here. During the final decades of the pre-colonial era, we continue. Less learned Northern European merchants, sailors, and soldiers of fortune established growing contacts with the island Caribs. Less familiar with the Hispanic stereotypes, these adventurers conducted predominantly civil trade relations. So you see, they was going to the islands for trading relations with the with Aboriginal populations, increasingly dependent on European ironware and spirits. Now, this is also conjecture because they traded a lot of the ironware, but they made their own spirits. But what was happening as they'd see further on, they were accustomed to giving and receiving gifts of these types of nature. So it was not uncommon for them to do that type of trade. But it wasn't like they didn't have no ironware or they had no spirits at the time of the European encounters. All of these peaceable exchanges in no way alter the negative images of metropolitan intellectuals. They created connections that would later facilitate French, English, and Dutch occupation of the Lesser Antilles. Right? So they're saying, apart from all these negative talk about them, the indigenous is who were the ones responsible for allowing these people to occupy the Lesser Antilles because of how they used to deal with them favorably with trade and other, well, basically trade mainly. A matter of fact, mainly trade. The rest was war. For most of the 16th century, however, island Caribs, remember now, all right, go ahead. You read it forward. For the most of the 16th century, however, island Caribs had to deal with the most difficult European people, the Spaniards, conquistadors, until at least the 1530s. And when we're talking about Spaniards, again, if you're now familiar to the readings, when we talk about Spanish, French, and English, we're not speaking about pale skin, thin hair people. We're talking about swarthy, they call them swarthy, tawny, woolly haired beings, right? That's what this description, you'd see it coming later on, that they call them tawny. We'll look up the meaning for tawny. However, we're continuing until at least the 1530s, Caribs persistently fought the Spanish occupation of eastern Puerto Rico while attempting to defend their islands against slave raids, punitive expeditions, and campaigns of conquest. They was defending their islands against slave raids. Right? They were raiding these islands and using the captives and prisoners of war as indentured laborers or slaves. Slave is a new terminology because Bukaj and them was born in Bukaj and they were born in the 1940s, I think, if I'm not mistaken. Yeah, in 1940s. So all our color coding had started already, well on its way. So where will we? Right. So when we speak of these people here, who were the invaders, Columbus was Swarty. Pietro, you'd see his name here, he was also Swarty. The king and queen of Spain was Swarty. And Europe was run by Swarty people at that point in time. There was no lepers running stuff at the top or sailing the seven seas. Or when we say lepers, we're talking about quote-unquote white people, quote-unquote white people, because they're not even actually that in their own senses. Caribs persistently fought Spanish occupation in the east of Puerto Rico while attempting to defend their islands against slavery, punitive expeditions, and campaigns of conquest. However, over time, both sides found it useful to establish fragile periods of entente during which Spanish fleets could victual in peace at Dominica and island Caribs could obtain the iron goods, axes, knives, manoric riddles, and iron pots, right? As if they did not do these things themselves. They so ardently desired. Nevertheless, the Spaniards had occupied parts of Cairi in the 1570s and supplied the Arawak, enemies of all Caribs. War once more became the norm of the relationship, right? And as I explained in part one, the Caribs and the Arawaks, as the so-called, were living in peace all the time until the Arawaks decided they're going to go beyond trade and invite them to the island and that type of stuff. And it created wars by their neighbors, or a matter of fact, a different part of their family, but it was all one big family. Fortunately for the Caribs, increasing numbers of Spain's enemies, Dutch, French, English, we have some beautiful weather this morning, appeared in the Lesser Antilles. And these merchants, pirates, provided alternate sources of European technology. In the short run, the abolition of the Spanish monopoly must have benefited the island Carib. In the long run, these northern Europeans came and stayed. Right, see about map back then of how it used to be. You can see Cairi here, drawn so much like it's always connected to the South American plate, namely Venezuela. Right. Ironically, before Europeans actually encountered them, island Caribs already possessed a reputation as bloodthirsty man-eaters. The marvelously fertile imagination of Cristobal Colon, Christopher Columbus, and his other names created the myth of Carib cannibalism. So everybody knows from primary school that Christopher Columbus was the one responsible for fabricating them stories, or lying, basically. On his first voyage, the admiral understood from Taino Arawaks of Hispaniola, and according to the writer in brackets here, or so he thought, that's what their sign language and facial grimaces meant. So they was giving him sign language and facial grimaces according to the writer, and he took it to mean that these Caribs were man-eating people. So on his account from the Arawaks of Hispaniola, that their feared enemies, the Caniba or Carib, inhabited islands to the east. His initial description of these cannibals as men with one eye and others with dog's noses, obviously reflected inherited classical and medieval notions about anthropophagy, inhabiting the far ends of the earth. So anthropophagy is the practice on eating near relatives' flesh in a ceremonial, ceremonial funerary rite, and that was part of the rite. People still do it to date. Especially those, all right, so they heard about the anthropophagy inhabiting far ends of the earth, especially those of the popular late medieval writer John Mandeville. So John Mandeville, you would hear later on, he was one big fabricator and storyteller, and to sell his performances, he would amp up the information in his storytelling. Some down outright lies, but it was for the entertainment of the people and for the establishing or exalting of his ego. Still, we continuing, as Peter Hume points out, Columbus initially was skeptical of Taino claims because he believed it possible that these Caniba were soldiers of the great Khan. Khan in Spanish, right? Caniba. By the conclusions which something to dig into. By the conclusions of his wanderings in the Caribbean waters, however, Columbus had persuaded himself that island Caribs were indeed fierce man-eaters and thus subject to enslavement. Although he admitted that he knew few Indian words, he facility and mistakenly assumed that the first non-Taino to offer resistance to his incursions was a Carib. So anybody who was opposing the incursions, they thought they were Carib. Columbus also came to accept the Taino-inspired idea that the cannibal island contained much gold. So it is not surprising to learn that the Lesser Antilles were the initial goal of his second voyage in 1493. Columbus intended to investigate reports of gold there and to enslave any cannibals he could catch. After cruising about Dominica, he set the landing party ashore at Guadeloupe, fully expecting a hostile reception. No Caribs were found in the village, but their female slaves confirmed by sign language again, presumably, that their masters were indeed ferocious man-eaters. The island party retrieved 4 or 5 human bones. Not unaware, they were not unaware of the Carib and the Taino practice of burning, so they was not unaware of that, but still they running to pick up bones to create the propaganda, right? Practice of burning dead bodies and preserving bones of kin. Columbus nevertheless concluded that the Taino accusations were accurate, and you'd see why. In a much publicized letter about this episode, expedition participant and eyewitness, quote unquote, Dr. Chanka expressed certainty about the anthropophagy of these Aborigines and described in sensational detail their culinary practices. All too soon, the very words Carib and cannibal became synonyms. Despite the absence of first-hand evidence or eyewitness observation, without even much circumstantial evidence, island Caribs acquired an ironclad reputation that resisted all empirical inquiries and critical examination until recent decades. As Hume usefully demonstrates, the term cannibal differed significantly from the old established word anthropophagite, which ordinarily referred to the ritual consumption of one's relatives after death. In contrast, cannibalism meant from the beginning what anthropologists call exocannibalism, the eating of those outside one's community. But it is also connoted a ferocious predator-like tearing apart of limbs. Dr. Chanka, for example, claimed that the bones picked up in the Carib village had been gnawed as early as 1520. A Spanish writer asserted that the term cannibal derived from canis, the Latin word for dog, starting with Peter Martaya de Anguera. That's the guy who used to rule with Columbus. Peter the Negro, Peter the Black, Peter the Nigger. Peter Martire de Anguera. He was a European writer, often compared Caribs to wolves preying upon the gentle lambs of the Arawak nation. So they call the Arawaks gentle lambs because the Arawaks was stupid enough to befriend them. And at the time, they liked them more than the ones who was resisting the invasion of the island. The emerging concept of Carib cannibalism had almost immediate consequences. Upon his triumphant return to Castile, Columbus urged Isabella and Ferdinand to permit enslavement of these cannibals. So that was his reason for not investigating and misinterpreting what the Arawaks was telling him. And so he could go to Isabella and Ferdinand to get back in to come and enslave these people. A people very savage and suitable for the purpose. That's what he's saying. and well-made and of very good intelligence. These qualities made them perfect candidates for galleys where Columbus shrewdly noted for the benefit of the pious queen, they could acquire civilization and Christianity. So they come here with the religious concepts, right? And call the islanders, the people who they met here, the owners of the island, call them cannibals in order for the crazy Swati queen, Isabella, to order the captive and the enslavement, the captivity and the enslavement of these so-called cannibals. So they could civilize them and bring them to Christianity. Not that the queen refused her royal share of slave trading proceeds. So where were they getting slaves? The Spanish, where were they getting slaves at the time? The English was nowhere wrong in terms of when the Spanish was exploring these islands. Only in the later half they bungs them up over here. You'd see further down. These Carib slaves, be continuing, could be payment for a large quantity of cattle needed for the island. The admiral's view that strong-bodied Caribs would make perfect slaves reflected deep-rooted Aristotelian conceptions, right? So using the island people as slaves, I thought was Africans. That's what they said when we was in primary school, right? And other schools, right? In 1503, Isabella authorized the enslavement of those guys. See, Isabella in 1503, shortly 1498, 99, 1500, 1501, 1502, 1503. 5 years later, after Christopher Columbus landed here on this island, Kairi, in 1503, she authorized the enslavement of the cannibals, the so-called cannibals. So inhumane as to resist Spanish arms and evangelism. Her concept is anybody resisting Spanish arms and Spanish religion means that you're inhumane, right? That you're inhuman, right? Much like the concepts of the globalists today, innit? This decision was reaffirmed by Ferdinand in 1511 and Charles I, in brackets Charles V, the Holy Roman Emperor after 1519, so in 1525. So the decision was reaffirmed by Ferdinand in 1511 and by Charles I in 1525, right? You see, all these fellas were Swati people. In 1547, Charles expected male Carib warriors from the new laws of 1542, which prohibited Indian slavery, right? Not African brethren, Indian slavery, right? Not satisfied, Spanish colonists repeatedly demand that Carib females be subject to enslavement, and the crown so granted in 1569. So you see, all this time in here, they were now exploring, now letting decrees rule on the islands. They had no contact with bringing anyone from Africa, 1500. So we covering all these dates and you'd see at no point in time, you would see they announced that they brought Africans over on this side. Furthermore, they would tell you, as we read in part 1 of the Carib series, that the Battle of 1797 and thereabouts, the Carib War between the British and the Caribs, they would tell you on account, even the War Office records of England would tell you that their forces were depleted in the Caribbean in that war. Just around the time where they say the British was bringing slaves from Africa. So with a depleted force, how would they do in that? The answer is they won't. We continuing from 1569. These edicts in practice allowed open season on all Indians. For anyone resisting Spanish imperialism was now considered a Carib. So they started using the term loosely in order to kidnap the ancestors and enslaved them. King Ferdinand's cedula of 1511, in truth, a declaration of war, charged the island Caribs inspired the Indians of the Greater Antilles, especially those of Puerto Rico, to revolt against their Spanish masters. And it's see Puerto Rico or Borinquen and Cairi is intricately linked. You would see that even since the 1500s and before. This is the first time it will be recorded. We'll see later on in the text here as we go on. Records in the Spanish archives indicate intensive slave raids and colonization projects in the Lesser Antilles from 1512 to 1517, including the famous Armada of Ponce de Leon in 1515. Not coincidentally, at this time, the Arawak population of Hispaniola was in catastrophic decline. So they was already raiding on that zone there up in Hispaniola because they met them before some of us down in the south. How successful these slavers were is uncertain. So they didn't know how successful they were. Although later Caribs lamented that Spaniards had killed most of their ancestors, which was kind of true at the time. As a matter of fact, was true at the time, because it's later on when the English came in, then significantly more started to die. Or were killed, sorry, but they weren't just dying like that. Barbados probably lost its Aboriginal population, which may have been island Carib. So at that time when they came in, Barbados had already lost, according to them, the island Carib population. Whether this heavy mortality can be attributed to Spanish arms or to the introduction of European disease is problematic. So they don't know which one killed them out. By our guess, we would state, or by certain other accounts as a matter of fact, we would state the diseases is the one that did the most damage rather than the wars themselves. Because these swarthy Europeans were carrying all kinds of diseases, and they intermingle and rape certain women and all that type of thing, and that's how the diseases spread. And you'd see later on, because one approach, they was friends with some Spaniards, and they made attempts at the women, and they kill out the whole clique. So there was always that kind of problems happening, because these guys were savages. The Spanish Europeans were savages, and they had no respect for the Carib women and their husbands. So they made attempts at them while in the presence of their husbands, and some of them even went as far as to rape them and were caught and killed. But we'll see that further down. The initial European image of Caribs reflected that these early decades of hostility. In his widely publicized letter, Columbus created the dichotomy of the gentle, pliable Arawak and the monstrous Carib. So Columbus was the one responsible for divide and conquer, because there were one people, right? Obviously, just like in every family, you have very docile people in a family, and then you have the warlords in the family who are born like that to protect the docile ones all the time. So when Columbus came, they did the divide and conquer. That's the first record in the 1500s of that divide and conquer. And so they started to rate the Caribs, the one who were like them and who wasn't doing them nothing for staying on the island for length of times and all that type of thing, right? Because as I was saying, they were all swarthy people, and the Arawaks probably in their capacity thought they were friendly because they look alike. They look similar to us, right? So we just going on with the concepts of what we're reading here and extrapolating it for that time. The immense influential decades of Columbus's fellow Italian, Pietro again, he was an Italian, right? And you'd see Columbus was in between from Port, we drift as I digress a little bit, we'd see where he was from. The nobles and them used to be the sailors, right? So Pietro Matteo de Anghiera, Peter Matteo, a courtier of Charles I. So he was no normal riding brethren with Columbus. He was a courtier of Charles I, propagated this Manichean approach to the Amerindians. He felt strong sympathy for those innocent sheep, quote unquote, the Arawaks, and a vitriolic dislike for those ravenous wolves, quote unquote, the Caribs. In one of his most cited passages, this humanist scholar asserts that these brutal men, cruel and terrible, live off human meat, impregnated captured women to assure an ever-fresh supply of human viands. These devils in the newfound Eden, as they used to call the Americas, evoked from Matthias' pen-slashing, colorful invective that contrasts greatly with the sweet, bland depictions of his beloved Arawaks. So they were creating a storyline to separate, just like how they come here and do that divide and conquer nonsense that they try around the world. Successfully, might I add. Matthias, as we continue, Matthias' resonant phrases and striking passages still echoed in geographical accounts 2 centuries later. So his fabrication, it lasted 2 centuries after his fabrications. Fierce Carib resistance to Spanish slavers and their subsequent raids on Spanish islands, such as Borinquen, inevitably confirmed the validity of the first impressions. Although the Aborigines were unable to prevent Spanish ships from taking on water and wood, indeed, Dominica was by the 1530s the official stopping place for Spanish vessels proceeding to the Greater Antilles and the mainlands. They did stop sporadic Spanish colonization efforts, such as that for Guadeloupe in 1525. Carib raids on eastern Borinquen apparently started as early as 1511 AD. Well, 1511. Increase in momentum in the later 1520s and reached a peak of intensity in the 1570s. So all through the 1500s, they were doing this, not bringing slaves from Africa, right? The presumed goals of these incursions, as we go on, beyond revenge for slave raids, were prisoners and iron weapons. Right? So at one point here, the writer was saying earlier on that they were trading because they so desirably wanted iron weapons and pots and that type of stuff. But we hear on this side, he's saying, where were it? Right. He's saying that these are incursions by the Caribs, reach its intensity in the 1570s. But they're saying the presumed goals for the incursions, beyond revenge for the slave raids, were prisoners and iron weapons. But basically, you would see that that wouldn't have been really the goal for the raids. The goal for the raids was Puerto Rico, along with Carib, was basically the house. They used to high-speed run on the waters between Puerto Rico and Carib, as you would see the confirm here later on. So when they tried to come and set up the colony on Puerto Rico, that's mainly the reason why they raided them, right? Obviously, the iron weapons and the prisoners would be a bonus to the raid, but it wouldn't be the sole reason why, right? Caribs employed the captives as slaves, and if one can assume that European arms and diseases thinned their numbers as potential recruits, like other Amerindians, the islanders adopted prisoners into the group, which may explain the numerous episodes in which they tried to prevent captive or shipwrecked Europeans from returning to civilization. So they would capture them anytime they shipwrecked or after war and use them for whatever they wanted them for. Prisoners of war. According to Spanish archives, these Stone Age people scored some remarkable victories against their European tormentors. For example, Caribs killed the survivors of the wreck of a Spanish treasure ship and stored the mineral riches in a cave near the sea. You would hear here the first mention of somebody being black, but they were never called black at that time because that's a later color thing. This is the writer conjecture here. A decade later, a free black woman. So a decade later, which would mean the 1600s, right? A free black woman. So they're talking about 15 when? 15, what was the date? Last date? 1525 or 1520, right? Or 1570. Right. So 1670. 1580. Sorry. Just 10 years later, all of a sudden, up pops a free black woman. From where? Right? A decade later, a free black woman who escaped from Carib captivity claimed that the looted gold and silver surpassed the height of a man on horseback. So in 1570, by 1580, there is no record of any Africans being brought to this side as we read in here so far. And if it was so significant that it brought 222 million Africans over here, then it would have been significant for them to record it while they was recording the lesser numbers, according to them, of the Caribs on these islands, and they didn't include those Africans here on the same islands that they were supposedly been. Up to a point where a decade later, a free black woman could come and give them an account after she escaped Carib captivity. So again, does she conjecture, avoid that type of nonsense when going through these type of documents. That's why we like to go right back to the eyewitness account and give, but Philip Boucher is here. You'd see in his site, like 20, you'd see in the glossary text at the back of the book, you'd see where his citations come from and the different manuscripts you come from. Some of them that I'm still going through right now. But as I said before, we don't want all the parts to be so long, so we're putting them out in parts. So be sure to follow them up so you'd see what they were talking about. But a decade later, right, they didn't even know Africa existed or haven't been to there yet. But a free black woman could jump out of somewhere and tell the Spanish that the height the height of the gold was surpassed the height of a man on horseback. Right? Many are European, and I could tell you where she come from. She came from Europe. They were taking the Irish and bringing them to the Caribbean. So Montserrat, Barbados, and Cairo were the three islands with the most amount of Irish prisoners of war or Irish indentured laborers that they brought to the Caribbean. So that's where this woman would have popped out from. She would have been indigenous to Europe, not Africa. Let's go. Many a European ship anchored off Dominica found its cables cut at night in the hope of a shipwreck. There are even some cases of ships captured at sea by Carib war canoes, periaguas, or pirogues. In response to these and other attacks, the Spanish dispatched raiding parties, set traps for Carib bowmen, and endlessly planned the final blow against these quote-unquote pests of humanity. The government, forever short of funds, sometimes hoped that missionaries might provide a cheaper solution. So Isabella and Ferdinand would be hiring missionaries now to go and antagonize these people out of their lands. Many, perhaps most of these monks were killed as the missionaries that they what they call them, boy, Capuchin monks, right? They were killed. 9 alone in 1603 to 1604, they killed 9 of them. Although from the 1550s on, they no longer purportedly suffer the indignation of being eaten, right? All of a sudden, as a famous legend explained, this reputed change in Carib degustation arose after some cannibals became ill after feasting on Spanish fire, as according to them. This account of Spanish-Carib relation is so far primarily one of the unremitting and mutual antipathy, right? That hatred, that underlying discrimination from these swarthy Spanish conquistadors. Yet, despite the recounted episodes above, there were many years in the 16th century without such encounters. And if that flesh was the major staple, how come they go in so long without eating, right? Bits of evidence support the views that Spaniards and island Caribs often exchanged goods with one hand while weapons occupied in the other. Right? So all right, so yet despite the recounted episodes above, there were many years in this with all these type of encounters. Bits of evidence support the view that Spaniards and island Caribs often exchanged goods with one hand while weapons in the other. Spaniards needed often badly provisions such as manioc flour, fish, yams, potatoes, and tobacco, whereas Caribs always were short of iron tools. And you could see after Nancy Gonzalez, the Caribs, according to her anthropology, the Caribs were making guanine, a fusion of copper and gold, right? So they were making metal. They were working metal. They were metal workers. So this as well has a lot of conjecture in it, right? The near silence of the Spanish archives on this issue is no evidence against it. After all, only bad news crossed the Atlantic to the Council of the Indies. There is some linguistic evidence to suggest that the Spanish-Carib relationship was characterized by years of cautious entente, as well as periods of war. See? As late as the 1650s, after many years of intense French contact, the Carib vocabulary contained more Spanish than French words, despite the contemporary conviction that Caribs love the French as much as they hated the Spanish. They love no one but themselves, which is rightfully so. As you would see, even the ones who they thought were friends killed some of them when they tried to go around the women. Given the tensions and outright conflicts between the two peoples, it is not surprising that literary images of Caribs remained abysmally negative. Abysmally negative. What changed was the Spanish writers, fascinated by the triumphs of Cortes, Pizarro, and other astonishing conquistadors, paid less attention to island Caribs. Given the retention of the prevailing stereotypes, who could hope to surpass the imaginative Mattia in invective, right? That's Peter, right? Who could pass in invective? His writings were so illustriously false, right? The lush Italian phrases turned to banalities in lesser writers. Gonzalo Fernandez de Oviedo, who twice stopped at Dominica in the 1520s in Route Española, railed at the abominable sins of these savages. The influential historian Francisco Lopez de Gomara, who never saw a Carib, and we have accounts of him writing whole books in my research, I've been seeing it, right? But he never saw a Carib, merely repeated the horrifying tales of, insatiable and Epicurean cannibalism he found in earlier sources. These authors express a deep abhorrence of what they considered gross inhumanity, but Mattia's intense shock at the very existence of such creatures is missing. Perhaps because Mataya, unlike the Spanish chroniclers, genuinely sympathized with the Amerindians, like the Arawaks. In the widely translated works of Oviedo and Gomara, we see perpetuated the none more evil reputation of island Caribs. The uniformly negative Spanish image of Caribs meant that two traditions emphasizing either positive or negative cultural traits did not emerge, as was, for example, the case vis-a-vis the Arawaks, Mexica, and Inca. Further damaging the Carib reputation was the fact that the word cannibals elicited a response of horror as well as fascination from European reading audiences. So they was coming down here and making books off of the people down here by fabricating lies on them, right? No Amerindian name, probably not even the Mexica and Inca, had greater recognition than the Caribs, Tupinambas, and Patagonians. Furthermore, the sensationalism created by man-eating accounts attracted those great popularizers and ethnographic simplifiers, the cosmographers. They pandered to the public thirst by endlessly recounting tales lifted from Mataya, Oviedo, and in the case of Brazilian cannibals, accounts contributed to America's Vespucci. That's idiot. Perhaps Sebastian Munster, a Cosmographia, 1544, which ran through 46 printings in 6 languages between 1544 and 1650, most effectively diffused such grotesque stories and illustrations as Mataya's depiction of the presumed Carib practice of gelding and fattening young prisoners. Francois Belleforest, who translated Munster into French with much updated material, reiterated the German's description of Caribs as the nastiest, cruelest, lustful, lying, abominable people in the world. As if we ever have any account of any German sailing from Germany to the New World. In these timings, there is no account. I yet to find them. If I do find them, I'll bring them forward. With perhaps competition only from Patagonians, Caribs were the ignoble savages par excellence for 16th century reading audiences. So we were the stars in the books for 16th century, basically the 16th century. To be sure, like other primitives and wild men of medieval lore, Caribs were described as strong, swift, and healthy. Listen, thus partaking of excellencies of animal world just below men in the chain of being. To readers nurtured on classic concepts, these physical blessings were indicators of aptitude to serve more delicate civilized men. So they're saying because of how they look and the strength and the abilities, they were to serve more civilized men, right? Who they consider themselves to be. We continuing. Physical and cultural attributes such as nakedness, scarification, long hair, and what? Let's see the word. Tawny color. We'll check up tawny. You'd see. All right, let me do that just for the sake of visual. Let's do it. As you can see, for those of you who new to this type of information and new to these type of words, here's the meaning of tawny according to Google. A color adjective, a color description. Tawny describes something that is a mix of yellow, orange, and brown colors. I want somebody to take these colors from a color pastel and mix them together and see what color you get. It almost looks exactly like copper. A lion has beautiful tawny coat, for instance. Tawny comes from the Anglo-Norman word to taoin, which means tan. So the only description they could have described it was when them get a tan, we looking just like them when them get a tan, right? Naturally. The overs and tannin is a kind of big brown color, so you know what type of definition of people are talking about. People referred to here locally as red man and yellow man in Jamaica and all them type of things. These were the people that they were talking about. All of them have woolly hair, right? So we're going back. So they were of tawny color, long hair, tawny color, as well as despised customs such as idolatry, crude diet, and filthy table manners, sexual license or sexual license, and cannibalism. No doubt scandalized readers. For traditional Christians, such savages were manifestly the playthings of Satan. Carrying on. Indeed, they looked like devils at their infamous drinking feast, the Wikus. That was a festival of drinks. And they were, as they're saying, this had alcohol and they made that themselves, right? In certain accounts, they want to make it look like we used to run them down for alcohol. And we carrying on, and they were a stunning example of man's depravity, unredeemed by Christ's grace. We still don't want Christ's grace. For those humanists who like to attribute golden age innocence to such Amerindians as Arawaks, Carib cannibals pose something of a problem. Peter Mataya, so well known for his idealization of Arawaks, found not in an iota of good to say about the Caribs. His fellow Italian, Girolamo Benzoni, who on the one hand chastised Spaniards for their unjust treatments of the Aborigines, nevertheless tagged Caribs with unpleasant epithets. Other humanists, reflecting Aristotle's hostility to uncivilized peoples, found much support for their anti-primitivism in contemporary descriptions of these quote-unquote bad boys. Of all the 16th century commentators on cannibals, only Bishop Las Casas professed to understand, at least in certain circumstances, the practicing of man-eating, anthropophagy, or anthropophagy, if you want to slow it down, right? So we're going in here, you get a little thing. I don't want to go too much to create it too long, but they're talking here about the Tupinambas from Brazil, right? On the next day, if we have any requests, we could go through the Tupinambas. But so let's carry on to page 29. Oh, 1 second. I think I'll do this again. Page, right. All right, so let's just widen this up so you can see. All right. Right, good. Back. Oh, this is one of the depictions, a drawing of one of the Tupinambas from Brazil who they said they baptized, right? A drawing. Of course, he can't really give a full account to the features, but we seen like apparently they have this one with a full head, right? But typical indigenous features, right? To date in Brazil, the indigenous does not have hair that look like this. So we don't know where this artist got this depiction from. And there was a big thing back then, the Tupinambas, when they baptized them. So obviously, whoever is the artist would like them to look like who they thought they should look like, and not who they actually look like, or what they actually look like. right? Good. So let's go. The overwhelmingly negative literary characterizations of Carib cannibals had little apparent impact on the increasing number of Frenchmen and Englishmen who established sporadic trade contacts with the islands circa 1550 to 1625. All this time, we ain't hearing nobody coming from Africa yet, right? All this time, we're not hearing British people going to the continent and picking up slaves and bringing them here, right? So pay attention to the dates. Notice the nonsense. Notice the lies. Privateers hunting Iberian shipping, illicit traders and colonists on their way to Virginia and Guyana often took on provisions at the Carib Islands and initiated trade relations. They choose the island of the Lesser Antilles because the Spanish, who had difficulty protecting even the lifelines of the empire, only occasionally bothered them. All right. So after the Spanish and them start to dwindle in the power in Spain, they also started dwindling harassment of the Caribs. Such Euro-Carib encounters were more often than not friendly because of mutual economic advantage and mutual antipathy towards Spaniards. Right? That's what they were dealing with them, dealing with the other Europeans, the Caribs. Right? They had a mutual discrimination towards the Spanish. Somewhat with the French, I think, yeah, at that time. Yeah. So that's why you'd see some of them working with the French as well. The pithy accounts or the pithy accounts of some of these interactions suggest between the lines that Caribs were cautiously eager to obtain new sources of ironware, firearms, and spirits. Their action toward the northern Europeans appeared remarkably consistent and civil. It must be emphasized here that Caribs view an exchange of goods as a transfer of gifts between friends. In fact, listen to this. The Carib word for exchange of goods and exchange of friendship is the same. They didn't put the word here, but we have a whole part to do with the language and certain words and things that remain to date. Like all the C words on this island, Chaguanas, Chagoramas, and all these type of places, Caroni and all these things is Carib words, right? So-called Carib words, called they were in Carib, they were called Carib, right? Also, we continuing, there is no word for trade, commerce, there is no word for trade, commerce, trader, or merchant, right? Because we wasn't of a commercial point of view, but many for gift and giver. Only when visitors gave the indication of overstaying their welcome, as happened to the English group at St. Lucia in 1605. So the English reached the Antilles them in the Caribbean here in 1605, around 1605, right? They didn't bring no slaves. There is no account of them bringing any slaves. So as it happened to English group on St. Lucia in 1605, or when Europeans like those accompanying René de la Laudonnière en route to Florida, offended Carib customs. So the Caribs were all up in Florida, right? In 1564, offended Carib customs where reprisals taken. As for the Europeans, for the most part, they appear unfamiliar with the grotesque literary image of the cannibals, right? And they as you would see, all this account on these people, but they spend so little time, and this guy wrote this in the, one second. But they spend so little time. This was published in 2008. So you see why they spend so little time on describing the physical features of these Caribs, even though they sell out themselves and said they were tawny, right? And they had long hair, right? Whatever they describe as long hair, we wear our hair. I still have my hair long right now, So where were we? So in that time they were taking offense and causing reprisals anytime any European offended them, all the way up to Florida. As for the Europeans, we continuing. For the most part, they appear unfamiliar with the grotesque literary image of the cannibals. Right? They appear unfamiliar because of the literary images that they put out. Right? On some occasions, when hostiles did erupt, the accounts indicate that Europeans had received stern warnings by Spaniards or other Indians not to be entrapped by the apparent friendliness of these sneaky and bloodthirsty savages, quote unquote. Caribs had strategic as well as economic reasons for encouraging cautious contacts with Northern Europeans. From 1569, the Spaniards had renewed efforts to control Cairi. Right? We knock off Trinidad a long time. They renewed efforts in 1569. There were no slaves around that time. Right? So we losing count for that 222 million Pan-Africanists. So they tried to control Cairi, and in so doing, aid their Arawak allies in a protracted struggle against Caribs. That's who we still call today some sellout tribes. Cairi was of great strategic interest to the Caribs, who visited frequently when trading and raiding on the continent. Spanish records indicate constant Carib attacks on the island. As when the Spanish came here, Carib attacks like rain. And we have some we looking to translate, and so we could get a better eyewitness account. So stay tuned for our next installment in the series. This Carib series could go on for about 40 years, to be quite honest. But we try to shorten it and bring it down into probably 6 months of work, 6 months to a year work, and we'd see how far we get with it. But what we want to do and are doing is changing the narrative, changing the picture, changing the historical accounts and misrepresentation of who we were and how long we were here, and whether they brought Africans or whether they kill us out and brought Africans, or whether we are the same people just called by a different name now. Right? As we continue, that contacts with Northern European could prove fruitful in this direction was demonstrated in 1613 when a combined foray of Dutch, hear them now, of Dutch pirates and Carib bowmen seriously threatened Spanish settlers. So we're about to delve into the Dutch a little bit, but it's, as I say, it's so much research, it could last up to 40 years. But we continuing. But the Caribs also had to deal with an increasingly aggressive Spanish threat to their home islands. Perhaps motivated by the killing of Dominican missionaries, the Crown granted license to make war against the island Caribs, and in subsequent years, many prisoners were sold at auction. Who were they selling? Not Africans. They were selling island Caribes. You understand? Islanda Caribes. That's who they were selling. Right? Not slaves. This is 1613. Right? So again, where are the Africans? All of you who on the island stating you have African ancestry and following African religions, where are your ancestors? Let's go. Carib-Northern European relationship in the Spanish Caribbean turned out to be a double-edged sword. Caribs of St. Vincent would see the Dutch, who had from the 1590s established ties with them because of their mutual hostility to the Spanish and the Arawaks at Cairi. All right, so certain Caribs started, because you would see, let me just digress for a bit here. You would see later on as we read, you would see that the Caribs and Arawaks shared a mutual bloodline, one, and they never considered themselves isolated to one island. They had you would see that they had whole islands reserved for planting alone, some reserved for the women and wives because they were polygamous and used to go from island to island and had different wives. And you'd see that they'd have some for mining, some for fishing. So that's why it was called the Caribbean, right? Because the whole stretch was Caribs moving back and forth and not isolated to one place like they want to have us today using dead people identification called passports to go from point to point, right? We're not doing that, and that's why I'm sure most people on the island have friends who've been island hopping without passport, right? Just as early as this year, one of my friends came back, right? And he didn't use a passport and he didn't use none of our indigenous ID either. So they've been doing this and they cannot stop it because it's been going on for thousands of years, right? So let's continue. So these Arawaks who were friendly with these Swati imperialists, they had a mutual hostility born against them from the Caribs because of the link with the Spanish, right? So let's go again. So Carib Northern European relationship in the Spanish Caribbean turned out to be a double-edged sword. Caribs of St. Vincent would see, which is Euromea, instead of calling them when we're reading. So Caribs of Euromea would see the Dutch, who had from the 1590s established ties with them because of their mutual hostility to the Spaniards, and Arawaks of Cairi settled at the St. Martins. Can't remember their indigenous name at this point. And then in 1628 at Alubera. So you see, up to now, we are seeing Africa. The latter island was as much a threat, to Carib communications as Cairi. And thus they expelled the Dutch, the ovals. So because of that link between the Caribs and the Dutch, the Spanish and them now decide they will expel the Dutch in order to kill that link. Caribs of St. Christopher, Dominica, all these is given names, not the actual names. Dominica, Martinique, Guadeloupe, unaware of tobacco revolution that sent European prices skyrocketing, witnessed increasing settlers' interest in the islands, especially as colonies in the Amazon Valley, South American plate, and Guyana failed to take root. That is because the majority of Caribs, or who they were calling Caribs, came from off the mainland, and our mainland is not the United States of America, nor is it Africa. Our mainland is South America, right? So they couldn't take root in our mainland. So on the other hand, Europeans who supplied Caribs with axes allowed more efficient production of pirogues, and their less frequent furnishing of firearms fostered Carib acquaintance with the Europeans' chief advantage in war. All right. Thus, in the years prior to colonization, of the Lesser Antilles, Englishmen and Frenchmen conducted reasonably civil relations with island Caribs. Whereas in Europe, at least some readers must have harbored nightmarish visions of these assassins of, quote unquote, assassins of men who drink blood. The contrast between the realities of cultural contact and the literary images is startling. In other words, they're saying one thing, they're coming and running down here to trade, they're thirsty to trade down here, but when they reach back in Europe, they're telling people it's savage down there, assassins who drinking man blood, grotesque looking beings, rah, 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 when nothing of the sort took place, right? The contrast between the realities of the cultural contact and the literary images is startling. In 1619 and 1620, so we run out the 1500s, we enter into the 60s, almost 1600s, almost mid 1600s, and no mention of the Africans. A group of stranded Frenchmen spent some 10 peaceable months among Martinican Caribs, an experience that permitted the anonymous author of a manuscript, right? And this manuscript, you'd see under 106, one of the manuscripts you're going through, right? The author of a manuscript to be remarkably free of ingrained prejudices against such strange peoples. Right? It's first you stay along so you get to realize, wait, these people's, wow, they're actually real good though. At nearly the same time in France, the author of a typical cosmography could dismiss Caribs with one phrase: savage, cruel, anthropophagites. Right? In England, despite frequent cordial contacts in the islands with these cannibals, some of which are related in Hakluyt, that sensation monger Samuel Purchas could chuckle to his readers that he omitted cannibal scenes from the accounts, Larry, because we have glutted you already. Right? So that's just the giving a little contrast on their writings about what was taking place. Whereas Tupinamba visits to France had a humanizing impact. No island Caribs appeared on the streets of Paris and London or saluted the king at Louvre and Whitehall. With the advent of the settling in 1623 to 25, St. Christopher, modern St. Kitts, and soon other islands, English and French settlers began to deal with the Caribs in a much more difficult relationship of that of contestants for limited land. The era of good feelings in the island rapidly drew to a close. It had never begun in the parlors and studies of the European elite. So what it's saying is, from time of discovery or time of their encounter with us in the 1400s up until the 1600s was basically a trade relationship, right? With wars, sporadic wars in between when they disrespect, just like always do today. We lie and talk to you normal, but as soon as we disrespect, we off with your head. So as soon as that happened, they changed the operations, right? And so now you would hear as we go into the next chapter. So we're not going into all the readings, as I say, we just touching the points that pertain to certain things, and it will lead back to certain other things. All right, let me see here. Oh yeah, I was here already. Right. So we go in here. The Dutch. Let me see, Jerry. 1 second. I covered this. There was all right, so we continue from here. All right, you know what? We continue right from here. Let's take it from here. Certainly of great importance was the renewal of overt hostilities with Spain, and in the case of France, increasingly frigid Cold War. At the end of the 12-year truce, 1609 to 1621, the Dutch States General, through the newly formed West India Company, the West India Company, and they turn all these companies into so-called countries or corporate entities. Through the newly formed West India Company, increasingly contested Spanish claims to the Caribbean Mare Clausum, or Mare Clausum, Caribbean Mare Clausum. Yeah. Spain's King Philip IV and his vigorous minister, the Count Duke Olivares, found their initial continental gains against the Dutch and German Protestants offset by losses overseas. None was more dramatic than the astounding Dutch capture of the treasure fleet of 1628. All right, this is kind of unrelated to where I want to go, so I'll start from here. The most immediate motive for European settlements in the Lesser Antilles was a quest for tobacco land. During the first 2 decades of this century, the Dutch and the English, and to a lesser extent the French, exhibited strong interest in the region between the Amazon Delta and the Orinoco, right at the bottom of our island, as sites for tobacco plantations. Cornelius Goslinger and Joyce Lorimer have extensively discussed Anglo-Dutch enterprises in the Amazon and Wild Coast. So the Anglo-Dutch were the most, the ones who were running that route down in the Amazon, being killed out and having unsuccessful things set up, tried to be set up. That was the Anglo-Dutch. Most of these settlements failed because of Portuguese countermeasures in the Amazon region and effective Spanish trust from Carib and Guyanan colonies. It is noteworthy, however, that the first attempted English settlement in the Lesser Antilles were offshoots of the South American failures. So after they failed on the plate, then they came to the islands and tried to settle here and conquer here. In 1605, because it was much smaller for them to maneuver around. When they go onto the continent, it's barrage of Caribs dealing with them. We continuing in 1605, again, we run in. When a group sent to reinforce Charles Lay's colony in Guyana could not reach it, they landed at St. Lucia, at Luanolao. Having provoked Carib hostility, the colonists departed. Thomas Warner, previously unsuccessful in the Amazon region, put in at St. Christopher in 1620 to search for suitable tobacco land. He liked what he saw. When Warner's subsequent colonial expedition arrived at St. Christopher in 1624 and a small French party disembarked the following year, they found a small Carib settlement there, probably the most northern of the Lesser Antilles, to contain a permanent Aboriginal population. That is what they're saying, probably the most northern. That is what they figured. That is what they found. The Lesser Antilles are a chain of small mountainous islands running about 500 miles northwest from Cairi and Alubera, near the coast of South America to the Virgin Islands, not far to the east of Borinquen and the Greater Antilles. Unlike the French, who called this island chain the Windward Islands, the English divided them into the southernmost windwards and the tiny northwestern leewards. Topographically, the islands range from relatively flat Barbados, a non-volcanic island, forget the indigenous name for Barbados too as well at this point, to those like Nevis and Dominica, which appear as if mountains arose phoenix-like out of the sea. The bigger islands, Guadeloupe, Dominica, Martinique, are at the center of the chain. Some of the smaller islands, such as Marigalante, do not contain sources of fresh water, whereas Dominica, there are, according to local legend, some 365 rivers. As a matter of fact, they say it's 120. Not sure we had to get a native from Dominica to give us that. Some islands, such as Barbados and Grenada, for example, contain extensive arable acreage, while others, such as St. Martin's and Barbuda, are nearly barren, according to them. However, most contain enough fertile land and water to support at least small colonies. Finally, the Atlantic coast of most of these islands were uninhabitable then because of the constant wind and lack of harbors. However, they were uninhabitable only for Europeans. For the natural resources of the Carib subsistence economy often flourished there, and the Aborigines' skill with their pirogues and smaller crafts allowed access to the windswept coasts, After the European arrival, the inaccessibility of these coasts to European shipping helps explain the Carib's survival strategy. On the eve of the Northern European invasion, Caribs inhabited many of the Lesser Antilles, but it is impossible to determine their population density. Here's why. Contemporary estimates range from the impossibly impossibly low figure, very impossible that it was that low, of 1,000 to an improbable high account. He's saying this is improbable, even though they would tell it that they was incapable of counting them, to an improbable high count of 25 to 30,000. A reasonable guess might be 7 to 15,000. Caribs did not inhabit fertile Barbados, although they apparently hunted and fished there. So as I was saying before, they had islands reserved for fishing, islands reserved for planting, islands reserved for hunting, island reserved for breeding, islands reserved. So they were living on all the islands. You would hear them come to that conclusion eventually. So near hostile Spanish, as we continue, so near hostile Spanish settlements in Cairi and Boriken, Grenada and St. Christopher contain small communities. Caribs shared Grenada with their allies and kinsmen, the Galibis of the Guianan coast. So you see, they say allies and kinsmen. When I keep telling people Kalinago, Galibi, what's the next name they call them? Anyway, they were all one family. And because they were moving from coast to coast and living from coast to coast, this is why people thought it had different tribes. But it was all one big family calling themselves by different names as it spread out from, like, I wouldn't be living by my mother and father anymore. And then my children one day wouldn't be living by me anymore. And that's just how it was going. And it had to spread out. Carib shared Grenada with the allies, kinsmen, the Galibis of the Guianan coast. The St. Vincent, Martinique, and Guadeloupe were among the most densely populated islands, according to them. Most densely to where they could have seek. Remember, these Europeans and them wasn't making their way into the interior. They were more staying coastal areas. So it's the most densely populated on the coastal areas if we want to be anything close to accurate. Carrying on, after Europeans expelled them from St. Christopher, Guadeloupe, and other islands, many Caribs took refuge in the easily defended island of Dominica, which today has a very strong Carib community. Also Carib reserve lands that their government put in place for them, although they don't need the government to do that because they own the island and the government is basically a terrorist organization on their island, which contained perhaps 5,000 people by 1647, compared to an estimate of 1,000 in 1606. So this is just what I will call a fool's interpretation of population of people. This mountainous retreat apparently only sparsely populated before 1492. So there was never here before, there was never in Dominica before 1492, but they could want to extrapolate as they were sparsely populated. The truth is, these clowns did know nothing. That is just the reality. So before 1492 was one of the final refuges from Spanish, French, and other European assaults. Notably, except for Rupert's Bay, Dominica lacks good harbors. Topography and Indian prudence prevented any serious demographic survey, you see, an account for such varied contemporary estimates of island Carib population. Their remarkable navigational skills, listen to this, making the Lesser Antilles a high-speed route for their pirogues. Also inhabited accurate counts. Polygamous males, I was just saying that, move frequently from island to island, visiting wives and relatives. War canoes constantly move northwest to Borinquen and Cairi and the mainland. So they had a route they used to run from Puerto Rico to from so-called Puerto Rico to so-called Trinidad to so-called, well, they didn't say Venezuela, but that would be right Venezuela on the south, right? So there was a highway, an indigenous highway, because these people used to live from Borinquen to Cairi, as far north as possible to south, right? Only toward the turn of the 18th century did any remotely reliable population figures become available. And by then, island Caribs had suffered such serious demographic decline due to disease, war, emigration to safer South American mainland that retroactive estimates are at best speculative. As a matter of fact, any estimate is speculative because none of them came in, none of them was a part of the society, and none of them came into the interior to live in the interior of the island. We continuing. Island Caribs had an agricultural and fishing economy that demanded diverse ecological milieus. Their main staples were flour made from hurricane-resistant manioc, rhizome, and sweet potatoes, while their men prepared ground by slash and burn techniques typical of tropical Amazonian cultures. Their women cultivated the roots and prepared manioc flour, for cassava cakes. These were used not only as a staple food, but as the basis for ritualistic meals. Right? So they were going they're going to the different diets that they had. Okay, I'm gonna go into this. Masticated cassava cake was the main ingredient of their principal alcoholic beverage, sakuti. Sound like sake, you know what I mean? Sweet potatoes also yielded an alcoholic drink. Other cultivated roots and vegetables, oh yeah, sweet potato wine is one of the most, get drunk very quick. Other cultivated roots and vegetables included maize and the ubiquitous red hot peppers that accompanied all Carib meals. So don't get it twisted. The Caribs and them was noted for eating the most amount of pepper. Tobacco and cotton were the chief non-alimentary cultivated plants. Caribs planted their gardens in various places in the islands to shelter them from hurricanes, manioc ants, and invaders. Where we at Martinique and probably elsewhere, the manioc patches were often located high in the more humid hills, making the women's task arduous indeed. Arduous, that is basically them, right? The women were accustomed to that. But Caribs of one island also planted, listen to this, but Caribs of one island also planted on unoccupied islands to serve as centers of provision for war parties, hunters, and fishermen. In case of invasion, these islands serve effectively as refugee centers. So they had the first refugee setup known to man. Such gardens also provided security against the devastation of hurricanes. Waterless Murray Galante provides an example. Hold on, sorry. Such gardens also provided security against the devastation of hurricanes. Waterless Murray Galante provides an example of these practices. Contemporary sources indicate clearly that Caribs planted vegetables and sea island cotton there just prior to the beginning of the rainy season. Hunting and fishing practices illustrated further these Aborigines' utilization of natural resources of many unoccupied islands, so-called unoccupied islands. On their home island, the men hunted small game, various fowl, and land crabs. They often went to different islands to capture sea turtles, so they was up and down. They never stayed one place for too long in terms of they had the living spot, but they were always back and forth. Some evidence indicates that Caribs of one island maintained fish ponds on others. All sources testify to their expertise as fishermen, whether in the open sea or lagoons and rivers. They also roamed wide areas to collect land crabs, fruits, nuts, building materials, and an amazing variety of medicinal herbs. In short, island Caribs had prudently created what could be labeled a commuter economy. And I will go as fast as to say the first commuter economy. right? They're now trying that in this, what they call the new or modern times. Community income is dependent widely on scattered natural resources. The universal comments on the chronicles about the Aborigines' robust health, they had robust health, are evidence of their economical adaptation. So they wasn't suffering down here as these guys would have liked to pretend. Is it any wonder then that these people bitterly fought the European settlement of unoccupied islands, so quote unquote unoccupied islands, as well as of their own? Or that the Caribs of one island help those of another protect commonly exploited resources? Europeans did not understand that Aboriginal agriculture and gathering demanded far more acreage than their own. Indeed, most Europeans seriously underestimated the importance of agriculture to the Carib economy. Even fewer recognized the character of the commuter economy. Even the invaders had in colonial situations, Europeans ordinarily refused to grant property rights to unimproved acreage, according to them, quote unquote, unimproved. What I have labeled a commuter existence, 17th century observers would have called vagabondage, right? A highly pejorative label. In sum, European occupation of the unoccupied, quote unquote, unoccupied Les Antilles was resisted on solid economic grounds as well as for more apparent strategic reasons. That's why the writer is saying, quote unquote, unoccupied, because it was blood clotly occupied, right? Going down. So as we move to another one, what page we on here? So we just pulling out certain accounts from his writings. Again, page 37. We go to here. Right. Page 47. All right, let me go to 46. Then take it from here. All right. Okay, so we take it from down on the bottom here, last paragraph. Downwind from Barbados, St. Lucia was the destination of 3 unrelated expeditions. Luanalau was the destination of 3 unrelated English expeditions in the years 1637 to 1640. So they still having expeditions in the 1600s, not transporting slaves from Africa. Thomas Warner dispatched the first. According to patchy evidence, the colonists lived at peace with local Caribs for 18 months before a seemingly unrelated event doomed this and a subsequent English group from Bermuda. In 1639, an English ship sporting a French flag treacherously took either 2 or 4 natives of Dominica as slaves. Caribs held responsible all the people of a nation for crimes against them. After all, prior to making war, did not they hold a uiku at which all warriors concurred in decisions? Yeah, that's what they do. So they hold a spiritual. So he's saying they attack them for these reasons, and based on these spiritual reasons is what more enshrined in the reason why they're attacking them. Because after the Uiku festival, they would get the decisions, they would consult the spirit world, and they would get the decisions, and as they all concur, war would start. Caribs drove the English from St. Lucia, from Luanalau. Then later, the same year, 1640, used the exotic tactic of burning red hot peppers to smoke out another settlement. So that's what they used to use red hot peppers for. Still to date, if you want to run insects out of your place and mosquito out of your place, including yourself, you got to leave the house as well. Get a little fire made out of wood in a pan and burst hot peppers on top of them while it lighting, like enough to cause it to smoke. You would get every living thing running out of your house, including yourself. Right? We continue. The same year, an English effort backed by the Duke of Warwick to settle Alubera failed. Alubera is just north of us that they call in Tobago. Right there in 1640, they were not bringing African slaves. Hell no. In 1640, they failed to settle Alubera because of Indian, who they call an Indian. And this is not 179-year-old nowadays so-called Indian. This is hundreds of years ago, tawny-colored, woolly-haired people they call in Indians, right? And we've had that clear, made that clear so many times, right? They were not here around that time. And when the colonists escaped to Carib, Carib pressure forced them to leave. So they run from Alubera, come to Carib, and as they land Carib, Carib light them up again. They had to leave. Warner sent a group to Marigalante in 1640 with the same result. So bear war, when they were bringing, we asking you Pan-Africanists and you islanders here, even on this island, who practicing so quote-unquote African spirituality, where did that come from? Where did you get that from? Right? And that is why we have our own mixes, and there are certain things like wake. Wake is not from Africa. Wake is an indigenous Carib thing, right? And that is why they have certain cultures here on the island, they're mixing in and calling African, and it would come from Africa, when really and truly you'd find the reality is that is indigenous cultures they picked up, and because the false narrative propagated in the 60s and the 70s about Africa, this and that, these people started, because nobody today, right, who talking anything about Africa and saying their ancestors from, none of them could trace where their ancestors come from. None. It's just word of mouth and word of mouth only. So where are these people coming from? We reach all 1640, half of the 16th century, or what it is 17th century, right? Going up to the 17th century, and there is no African. And then we have in 1797, the Carib War. So when were they bringing them? When did they bring them? We ask you again. Can't answer. The question is, it's very hard. If it's have 2% African descendants here, that is extremely plenty. And I use extreme because that's how serious it is. You can't find no evidence of them bringing no Africans here. Okay, digress a bit, we're going on. In 1642, a second Warwick-sponsored effort at Alubera was also unsuccessful for the same reason, right? The indigenous run them off the island. Island Caribs had dramatically thwarted English attempts to dominate the Lesser Antilles for years. So how they were bringing African slaves? Somebody tell me. The French, not the Caribs, were the ultimate beneficiaries of the fierce indigenous resistance to English expansion. Numerically weaker than the English and having already suffered the terrors of guerrilla war with the island Caribs, so-called Caribs, island colonists and their governors usually pursued the path of diplomacy. So they don't want to war no more, they want to talk now. At Guadeloupe, or Bert had inaugurated a successful policy that his successors imitated. Upon arriving in 1640, he had gone to Dominica and with the help of presents and much brandy concluded peace with the natives. He then exchanged hostages, and one of these, Captain Le Baron's son, came to live with Howell as a son, or Howell as a son. Albert had also engaged in the potentially, now listen, these people is copper-colored tone, right? These fellas coming in, Captain Lee Baron and them coming in. How come he could leave this guy here as one of the natives and them son? You think he'd be pale skin? You take one of a melanated guy calling a pale skin guy his son, even though that is chronologically correct. But it is very unlikely, right? Just food for thought. Albert had also engaged in potentially dangerous game of giving Carib firearms for use against their Arawak enemies. His successor, Howell, served as a parent for a number of young island Caribs and established a school for young girls that accepted Caribs. You hear this? In 1640. According to contemporaries, Dominican Caribs much esteemed him. By the mid-1640s, the bonds between the French and Caribs were strong enough to permit Father Breton to live at Dominica. So quite in the 1640s, one of them could have got allowed to live. It seems reasonable to conclude that owing to these and other conciliatory factors, conciliatory French gestures, island Caribs made peace in order to concentrate their forces against the rapidly expanding English Isles. In short, this was real politic Carib style. You know what I mean? Real politic Carib style. We going again. I don't want this one to be so long. We do a little bit of jumping out of the book and coming back to the book because the book has a lot of information in it. But what we want to get to is more like where he draw his reference to. See all these numbers here is references that where he draw his citations from, his quotations from. So we want to go into these first-hand accounts and give a more in-depth look at these people's point of view when they came into contact with our ancestors. By the end of 1640, this political dynamic of Euro-Carib relationship were in flux. Chastened by the earlier debacles, English colonies became less expansive. So they couldn't expand. All in the 1600s, these people couldn't expand. So where would they bring in slaves to expand and work? Where? The great pioneer and sponsor of many expeditions, Thomas Warner, died in 1649. Other factors also helped check English designs on Carib Islands. Although far more important in Barbados than in Leewards, the sugar revolution of the 1640s occupied the energies of emerging island elites. The parliamentary royal conflicts in England also promoted caution concerning expansion. Questions about the legitimacy of land titles to newly conquered land islands became matters of concern to colonists. After Cromwell, I think it's Oliver Cromwell is his whole name, came to power, most islands maintained a neutral stand, except for Barbados, where Governor Francis Lord Willoughby was an avowed royalist. A fleet sent out in 1651 returned to the royalist island to parliamentary control. In uncertain circumstances, it is not surprising that few colonial endeavors are reported in the archives. Few of them. Finally, in 1655, Cromwell's Western design dramatically refocused English goals in the Caribbean to the non-Carib island of Jamaica. More Arawaks was there, but they were also Arawaks and Caribs are all one people, as you would see. Despite a decline of English interest in occupying Carib Isles, there was no peace as Aborigines continued periodic raids, especially against Antigua. So again, people, when were they bringing Africans? You would see the writer would jump in to say, by the 1640s and during the early 1650s, the question of Black slaves in Carib communities over on this side here pose an increasingly troublesome issue in European Carib relations. Since the 16th century, island Caribs had captured Africans from Spanish Puerto Rico. When again, these writers, he's a part of the nonsense as well, Mr. Bocage, because he gave no record. He gave records of all the other people coming to the islands, but they give no records of how these Africans come to Puerto Rico, right? From Spanish Puerto Rico. And where in the African records to date are there any Spanish coming on to the continent to capture any Africans and bring them to Puerto Rico? Somebody please present that, right? But there were Irish who they were capturing from the Europe and bringing them down here. That's who the black slaves were, right? So we're going further. Okay. Let's go. Right. Here from the decade separating the colonists, the decade separating the conclusion of the Dutch War, the Treaty of Nijmegen, 1678, and the outbreak of war of the League of Augsburg in 1689 was one of peace, or rather absence of war in the islands. Neither Whitehall nor Versailles attach a high priority to maintaining military forces in the Lesser Antilles, and war or the threat of war had exhausted both islands' officials and settlers. Island Caribs, however, did not partake of this mood. Those of Dominica continued to strike at the English leeward. So all after the so-called, when they say the British was bringing people to on where we just come out of Puerto Rico, they didn't say they was bringing. They said the Spanish had a slave from there. They didn't say they was bringing them. But all that time in here, you're hearing that they still was getting war against. So how were they doing that? So Vincentian Caribs had peace with the English until, those of Dominica continued to strike at the English leewards, and they caused problems for French authorities with increasing activity in the illicit slave trade, right? And was not Africans. You could go check out our Carib How on YouTube, and you'd hear about the Irish who they were bringing to the Caribbeans, right, as slaves. And that was the true Middle Passage. Sounds strange, but the truth is stranger than fiction. Vincentian Caribs at peace with the English until 1686 repeatedly annoyed the French at Grenada, who imperiled the Indians' security. The responses to these Caribs provocations will vary. French island officials blustered about extermination campaigns, but lack of metropolitan support forced them to resolve the problems through diplomacy. So they had no support, and that was back in the days of the French. These peace policy ultimately returned dividends to the French. On the other hand, the English leewards, without means of communication with the Dominica Caribs, resorted to force, which only resulted in further French gains amongst these aborigines. After 1685, gunboat diplomacy from Barbados was equally effective in neutralizing the Carib threat or in attaching them to the English sphere. It was Colonel Stapleton that previously inveterate francophobe, inveterate francophobe, who proposed a treaty of neutrality in 1678 with the new French governor general, the Comte de Blenac. The Bass died in 1677. Stapleton's hard analysis of English military weakness in the Caribbean explains his peace overtures. So all in 1677, they were weak. The English was weak in the Caribbean. The few regulars in the islands had terrible moral problems due to negligence of royal authorities, and Stapleton's own credit had reached exhaustion. But French islanders were not in much better condition because in 1677, the Estrees had stripped the colonies of men and materials for his spectacularly failed assault on Curacao. The proposed Treaty of Neutrality included an article that neither side would incite island Caribs against the other. So it was so dread that they had to have a treaty amongst themselves, the Europeans, that here we're going on. We're not going on encourage no island Caribs to come and fight all here, and we want you to not encourage no island Caribs to fight us, because it was devastating them, both sides. While London accepted the treaty, Colbert balked because he wanted to include all of the Caribbean possessions, including Chimaka and Saint Domingue. I think it's Saint Dominguez. Santo Domingo, it's supposed to be probably, but later became Santo Domingo. In 1679, the French broke off negotiations, although the proposal ultimately re-emerged as the core of the latter, more general Treaty of Neutrality of 1686. In the islands, however, officials found it convenient to follow the spirit of the unratified accord, and some 8 years of peace and reasonably good relations ensued. All that time, they wasn't bringing slaves. Within this context of peace, both sides attempted in different ways to resolve conflicts with the island Caribs. Blenac took advantages of the Estrees fleet to force peace on two powerful Vincentian chiefs, Pierre Meognac and Ionana. They agreed not to inhabit Grenada or even go there without permissions of the colony's governor. They pledged also to fight for French in all future wars. Finally, the chiefs promised to inform Caribs on Kairi and on the mainland of this agreement and try to gain their assent, right? But you would see to no avail, because there was the Great British War against the Caribs, or the Great Carib British War. So today, for this installment, we'll stop here. We all almost run into 2 hours reading, but again, we've seen all up to the 17th, from the time of discovery all up to the 17th century. There were wars. When they were supposed to have had slaves being brought to the islands, and we could see that no such evidence as any such thing exists. It is merely a distortion in narrative that caused all this so-called African talk to be promoted in the Caribbean, right? And certain other vehicles such as reggae music, nothing wrong with the music, but the lyrics are about Africa and them subsequently claiming things being African, when we could clearly see here that the whole of Jamaica was basically Arawaks, right? And the Maroons, who calling themselves Maroons as well, they would have been marooned from a different part of the planet, not Africa at all, right? They either were marooned between the bringing and the Middle Passage from the Irish in Ireland and that slave passage, or between islands, from island to island, and ended up on Chimaka. But anyhow, the reality of the fact of the matter is that there is no record Absolutely none whatsoever. Between 1400 to 1700, any slaves being brought. And I will take you from 1700 to the 1900s, and you would see there was none still ever being brought either, especially on this island, Kairi, and as so insofar and so much as the rest of the Caribbean, right? So, again, we want to thank every one of the listeners for lending an ear. Please share and dump in the Pan-African zones and cause the conversation to be had so we could change the narrative that we did not come from Africa. We were always here. Thank you for your time. See you in the next installment.